Laughter stopped the second I spoke Cantonese. Not nervous laughter, not polite, trailing off laughter. Complete silence, the kind that drops over a dinner table like a power outage. My father-in-law's chopsticks froze halfway to his mouth. My mother-in-law turned the color of the white tablecloth, and my wife, who I had been married to for 4 years, who I had driven to every prenatal appointment, who I had held in the hospital when our daughter came into the world, looked at me like she was seeing a stranger sit down at her family's table for the very first time. Let me go back. About 3 hours. My name is Patrick Brennan. I'm 42 years old. I work in project management for a mid-sized construction company in Mississauga, and until that Saturday in March, I thought my life was, if not perfect, then at least honest. That's the thing about being deceived by people who are very good at it. You don't feel the ground shifting. You just feel the ordinary texture of your days. My wife, I'll call her by her first name here because she's earned that, Vivian. We met at a fundraising gala for sick kids in downtown Toronto 6 years ago. She was there with colleagues from her accounting firm. I was there because my company had bought a table and nobody else wanted to go. She was sharp and funny, and she had this quality I can only describe as complete attention. When she talked to you, she made you feel like you were the only person in the building. I know now that this is a skill, not a personality trait. At the time, I thought I was lucky. Her parents, James and Helen Lau, had emigrated from Hong Kong in the late 90s. They ran a successful import business out of Markham, luxury goods, home furnishings, that kind of thing. They'd always been cordial with me, warm enough in a controlled way, like a thermostat set to exactly the right temperature, never higher. I'd attributed it to the usual father-in-law reserve, to the cultural gap, to the fact that they probably imagined a different kind of son-in-law when they pictured their daughter's future. What none of them knew, not Vivian, not her parents, not a single person at that dinner table, was that I had spent 3 years working in Hong Kong and Shenzhen between 2010 and 2013. I was managing logistics for a Canadian infrastructure firm expanding into the Pearl River Delta. The work demanded Cantonese. I got good. Not tourist good, not menu ordering good. I mean Cantonese television, Cantonese jokes, Cantonese business negotiation, reading subtext and register and the specific weight of what isn't being said. That kind of good. When I met Vivian, she mentioned her family spoke Cantonese at home. I didn't bring up my years in Hong Kong. I'm not sure why at first. We were just getting to know each other. Then time passed and it never came up naturally. She spoke flawless English. We had no need for it. And there was something else, something I'm not proud of, that I didn't examine clearly until much later. I liked knowing something they didn't. Call it the instinct of a man who'd grown up as the scholarship kid at a private school, always a little aware of who held the power in any room. It felt like an edge. I filed it away. The dinner invitation came from Vivian on a Wednesday morning while I was packing my daughter Abby's lunch for school. Abby was 4. She still called her maternal grandparents Gung Gung and Po Pi, which melted me every single time. Vivian said her parents were having some people over Saturday evening. Her cousin Vincent was visiting from Vancouver with his girlfriend, and there'd be a few family friends. Nothing formal. Something was slightly off in the way she said it. She didn't quite meet my eyes. I put it down to the week we'd been having, a disagreement about money, about the line of credit her parents had suggested we take out on the house for what they described as a business opportunity I'd been skeptical of. I thought that was the tension. I was half right. Saturday, I drove Abby to her swimming lesson in the morning, came home, changed into a blazer, and we drove to her parents' house in Markham. It was a large house, the kind of house that communicates decades of disciplined saving and calculated investment. Helen opened the door with that precise smile and kissed Vivian's cheeks and told Abby she'd left her slippers by the door. To me, she said, "Patrick, good, you're here. Come in," in a tone that suggested my attendance was an administrative formality. Vincent I'd met a few times. Mid-30s, worked in finance in Vancouver, always slightly overdressed for the occasion. His girlfriend, a woman named Michelle, I was meeting for the first time. There were two other couples I hadn't seen before, the Wongs, who were apparently old friends of James's from their early years in Canada, and a man I was introduced to simply as Frederick, described as a business associate from Montreal. We gathered in the formal dining room. Helen had made a full spread: suyuk, steamed fish, stir-fried greens, clay pot rice. It was genuinely extraordinary food, and I said so, which earned me a slight softening around her eyes. The first 40 minutes were bilingual in the careful, performative way of families who are managing an outsider at the table. English for the toast, Cantonese for the real conversation, with occasional English translations offered to me that summarized about 30% of what was actually being said. I smiled and nodded and served myself more rice and played the role I'd apparently been cast in from the beginning. The pleasant, slightly dim English-Canadian husband who didn't need to follow the conversation because there was nothing in it worth following. That was when I started really listening. The shift came when Abby was taken upstairs by Helen to watch something on the iPad, which in retrospect I think was planned. The adults relaxed. The English almost entirely disappeared. Frederick said something to James in Cantonese. His tone was low, consultative. He said, "The property assessment came back. If we move the transfer before June, the tax exposure is manageable." James nodded. He said, "Patrick's name is on it now. That part is already done." I kept eating. My face did not change. Mrs. Wong said, "He doesn't suspect anything." Helen said, with a particular warmth she reserved for discussing me when she thought I couldn't understand, "He's very trusting. It's a Canadian thing." Vincent said, "Not unkindly, but not kindly either, Vivian. Are you sure he won't ask questions when he sees the paperwork?" And Vivian, my wife, the woman I had driven to emergency at 2 a.m. when she thought she was having a miscarriage, the woman I had stood beside at City Hall and meant every word, said, in Cantonese, in her parents' dining room, with the clay pot still steaming between us, "He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. He always does." My fork touched the plate, very quietly. I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't rage. It wasn't the dramatic surge of movie betrayal. It was something colder and more clarifying, like the moment your eyes adjust in a dark room and you realize the shapes you thought were furniture are something else entirely. I understood, in about 4 seconds, that there was a real estate transaction happening that involved my name and my house and my signature, and that every single person at this table had been briefed on it except me. Frederick continued. He said the line of credit would clear by April. He said the company structure was clean enough that Patrick, he used my name, just my name, like I was a line item, would have no direct claim once the assets were repositioned. James said, "Good. The Markham property transfers to the holding company. Patrick is a silent guarantor. He has no shares, no directorship. If it folds, the liability is his." I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, thought about Abby upstairs watching the iPad, thought about the line of credit documents Vivian had put on the kitchen counter 3 weeks ago, already tabbed for signature. I had asked questions. She had answered them. Her answers, I now understood, had been as carefully constructed as everything else. Helen was saying, after the transfer, it simplifies everything. Vincent said, "What does Vivian do after?" A pause. Then Vivian said, very quietly, in Cantonese, "I don't know yet. Maybe stay in the house for another year, for stability, for Abby." So I was the house. I was the stability. I was the signature on the liability and the useful Canadian name on the mortgage and the man who would sit at this table eating excellent suyuk while my financial life was restructured around me. Mrs. Wong said something sympathetic in Cantonese about it being hard, these arrangements, but necessary. Vivian said, "He's a good father. This isn't about Abby." Helen said, "It's a business decision." I set down my water glass. I looked at my wife, who was looking at her mother, and I said, In Cantonese, in the accent I'd spent 3 years building in the streets of Kowloon and the offices of Shenzhen, I said, "Where mife? Where winnows sedchich? Joe Manel." Which translates roughly as, "Could someone explain how this transfer document works? I'd like to know more." The silence was total, absolute. Helen's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. Mr. Wong set down his chopsticks. Frederick looked at James. James looked at Vivian. And Vivian looked at me with an expression I will never entirely be able to describe. Part shock, part grief, part something that might have been, underneath everything, relief. Nah. Ish. She said it barely above a whisper. "You speak Cantonese." 3 years in Hong Kong, I said. I should have mentioned it. I can see why that was inconvenient not to know. Nobody spoke. Abby's laughter drifted down faintly from upstairs. I looked at James. I want to understand the structure of what's being proposed. I want to understand exactly what my name is attached to and what the exposure is, and then I'd like to speak with my wife privately. James, to his credit, did not bluster. He nodded once, very slightly, in the way of a man recalibrating. We left shortly after. Abby fell asleep in her car seat before we reached the highway. Vivian sat in the passenger seat and did not speak for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. She finally said, "How long have you known Cantonese?" "Before I knew you." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I didn't have a reason to, until tonight." Another long silence. Then, "I'm sorry, Patrick." I didn't answer that. I wasn't ready to know yet what I was accepting an apology for, the dinner or everything behind it. I got Abby inside and into bed and read her 2 chapters of her current favorite, a picture book about a beaver who builds a dam in completely the wrong river and has to figure out how to start over. She was asleep before the ending. I sat in the rocking chair in her room for a while after in the dark. Then I went downstairs, poured myself a glass of scotch, sat at the kitchen table, and started making phone calls. My brother-in-law, Vivian's brother, actually, a man named Dennis, who had always been straight with me and who I believed had no part in this, was my first call. "I'm sorry to call late," I said. "I need a name. The best property and family law solicitor you know, real estate fraud, potential matrimonial asset concealment, liability exposure." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "That bad?" I said, "I need the name Dennis." He gave me one. The second call was to my own accountant, a woman named Barbara who had been doing my personal taxes for 9 years. I left a voicemail explaining I needed a full review of any documents bearing my signature from the past 18 months and that I believed there may have been disclosures made in my name without full informed consent. I told her it was urgent. Then I sat there with the scotch and tried to understand what I was actually dealing with. What I had pieced together from the dinner conversation was this. James and Helen's import business had been restructured into a holding company. There was a property transfer in progress, likely the Markham house, possibly other assets. My name had been placed on a line of credit. Vivian had either been directed to do this by her parents or had agreed to it, and the end state involved a clean separation of assets in which I held the debt and they held the equity. The phrase Frederick had used, silent guarantor, was the part that kept surfacing. It meant I was legally responsible without being legally protected. The lawyer Dennis had recommended was a woman named Sandra. Actually, no. I won't use her name here, I'll just call her the solicitor. She was in her late 50s, Scarborough-based, with a reputation for being meticulous and entirely unimpressed by people who arrived at her office with more money than ethics. I got an appointment Monday morning. I brought the line of credit documents, the mortgage papers, 3 years of joint financial statements, and 4 pages of notes I'd written out Sunday night from memory, capturing everything I had heard at the dinner table in Cantonese, translated into English, time-stamped. She read through everything without expression. Then she looked up. You understood all of this at the dinner. Every word. And they had no idea. None. She nodded slowly. Then you have a daughter. 4 years old. She closed the folder. All right, here's where we are. What followed was 2 months of the most exhausting, disorienting, costly work I have ever been part of. The solicitor filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the property transfer pending investigation, citing potential matrimonial asset dissipation. The line of credit was flagged through the bank for review. A forensic accountant was brought in to trace the money flow between Vivian's personal accounts and the holding company. It turned out there were 3 transactions totaling a little over $200,000 that had moved through a joint account. My joint account, without my knowledge, used to capitalize a numbered company in which I held no interest. Vivian's lawyer argued that I had been a passive participant in a family business arrangement and that the transactions were within the normal scope of marital finances. My solicitor dismantled this with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. She pointed to the fact that I had been excluded from every discussion. She pointed to my handwritten account of the dinner conversation. She pointed to the certificate of incorporation for the numbered company, which listed James, Helen, and Vivian as directors and had been registered 4 months after Vivian and I were married. We were in family court in Brampton by May. Vivian's parents retained separate counsel and appeared as third parties with an interest in the property. It was, to put it plainly, a lot of very expensive people in a room trying to sort out who had done what to whom. The family court judge reviewed the evidence in sequence. When she got to the dinner conversation, my transcription, submitted as a statutory declaration, she looked over her glasses at Vivian's lawyer. Your client's position is that her husband was a knowing participant in these financial arrangements. Correct, Your Honor. And yet, there is a sworn account of a dinner at which your client and her family discussed those arrangements in a language they believed the applicant did not speak, and in which they explicitly noted that he would, quote, sign whatever she put in front of him. Vivian's lawyer made a procedural objection. The judge acknowledged it and then, with the particular economy of language that very good judges use, indicated that she'd take it under advisement and that the declaration would remain in the record. Vivian and I had one conversation during all of this that wasn't routed through lawyers. She came to pick up Abby on a Wednesday evening, and Abby was still getting her shoes on. And Vivian and I stood in the front hallway of the house we had bought together. She looked tired in a way that was different from anything I'd seen before. Like something behind her eyes had gone quiet. She said, I didn't think it would go this far. I said, which part? She didn't answer right away. Then, my dad said it was a clean structure, that you'd never be at actual risk, that it was just tax efficiency. It was fraud, I said. Whether you understood that or not, it was fraud. My name, my liability, my signature on documents I wasn't informed about. I know. Did you know before the dinner? A pause that told me everything, yes. I looked at her. When did you decide to go along with it? She shook her head. It's not that simple. With my family, it's never. I know, I said, but it's still what happened. Abby came skidding down the hall in her boots on the wrong feet, and the conversation ended, and Vivian crouched down and helped her switch them, and for a few seconds they were just a mother and daughter in a hallway figuring out left from right. And I watched and felt the specific grief of something that was real inside something that had also been false. The judgment came in August. The property transfer was voided. The $200,000 in improperly moved funds was ordered to be returned to the marital estate for fair division. The line of credit was restructured to remove my liability for the portions that had financed the holding company. James and Helen's counsel attempted to argue that the funds had been a gift from parents to a married daughter, and the judge found this argument, in her words, inconsistent with the documentary record. The divorce was granted on the basis of marriage breakdown, Vivian and I agreed on joint custody, primary residence with me given that I had been the primary caregiver and had the more stable schedule. Vivian has Abby every other weekend and 1 weekday per week. She moved into an apartment in Richmond Hill. She's still in accounting at a different firm now. Her parents' holding company is under a separate civil action that I'm not part of and won't speak to. What I want to say, in case anyone reading this is in the middle of something similar, not the same, because these things are never exactly the same, but similar, is that the documents matter more than the conversation. I had the conversation, yes, and the conversation was damning. But what won the case was the paper trail that the conversation led me to go looking for. Without that dinner, I might have signed the next document Vivian put in front of me without reading it carefully enough. Without that dinner, the transfer might have cleared in June. The hidden skill matters, but what you do the morning after is what determines everything. And this, if you are co-signing anything, if your name is on any financial instrument in a marriage, understand what it means before you sign it. Read it. Hire someone to explain it to you if you have to. I was not a naive person. I was a reasonably intelligent professional who trusted his wife and didn't think the trust needed to be qualified. I was wrong about that, and the correction cost me 2 years of my life and more money than I want to calculate. Abby started junior kindergarten in September. She drew a picture in her first week of school, a house, a person, a cat, though we don't have a cat. When I asked her who the people were, she pointed at the taller one and said, "That's you, Daddy." I said, "Who's the cat?" She looked at me like I'd asked the most obvious question in the world. "That's my cat that I'm going to get." I'm looking into it. She's usually right about these things. I still speak Cantonese. Not every day, but I keep it up. Podcasts during my commute, dim sum places in Scarborough where I chat with the staff, an online class Abby has started asking to join because she decided last month that she wants to be able to talk to P directly, which is its own complicated conversation for another time. But I'll teach her. You should know the language of the room you're in. You should always know more than you let on, and when the moment finally comes to speak, and if something is wrong, that moment always comes. You should be ready to say exactly what you mean. There are still evenings when I sit at that same kitchen table after Abby is in bed and think about the dinner, about Helen's teacup pausing in the air, about Vivian's face, about the precise length of that silence. And I think I almost didn't go. I almost suggested they go without me that Saturday, told them I'd catch up on some work at home, taking the easier night. If I had, the transfer would have cleared. The documents would have been signed. I would have spent years as a silent guarantor of a liability I never agreed to. Sometimes the things that save you don't look like anything at the time. They look like a dinner invitation from people who don't particularly want you there. They look like a Saturday evening you almost skipped. "You speak Cantonese," Vivian had said in the car. "I do," I told her. Some things, it turns out, are worth knowing quietly for a very long time. I keep coming back to the moment Helen's teacup stopped in the air. Not the verdict, not the injunction. That teacup suspended and the silence underneath it. What I understand now, looking back at everything that happened between that Saturday dinner and the August judgment, is that the situation had its own logic, a chain of causes that nobody could interrupt once it started moving. James and Helen had spent decades building something. They had a structure in mind, a plan that was efficient and clean on paper, and it required a certain kind of person in a certain role. They chose me for that role because of what they believed about me, and what they believed about me was based on what they could observe. They observed a man who was polite and undemanding and who signed documents without pushing back too hard. They were not entirely wrong about what they saw, they were wrong about what it meant. That's the part I've had to sit with honestly. I was trusting in a way that had some passivity in it, not stupidity. I want to be clear about that for anyone who's been in a similar position and blamed themselves. Trusting the people closest to you is not a character flaw, but I had let trust become a substitute for attention. I signed things I should have read more carefully. I accepted explanations I should have followed up on. Part of me, I think, didn't want to find anything wrong, because finding something wrong would mean the life I'd built was not what I thought it was. That avoidance cost me. What changed everything was not luck. It was Cantonese. 3 years of showing up every day in a city where I had to earn my place, where the language was not handed to me, where I had to be genuinely curious about people and places that weren't familiar. That curiosity, the willingness to put in the time to actually understand something rather than settle for the surface of it, was what I carried out of Hong Kong and into that dining room in Markham. I didn't speak Cantonese at the dinner because I was clever. I spoke it because I had once been the kind of person who committed to things fully, and that version of me was still in there, still paying attention. And then the months after, the forensic accountant, the statutory declaration, the solicitor's patience with the paper trail, that part was not dramatic. It was grinding, expensive, demoralizing work that required me to show up every single day and keep going, even when I couldn't see clearly how it would resolve. Abby needed me stable. The case needed me focused. I didn't have the option of falling apart, and so I didn't, and I want to say plainly that getting through something hard is less about strength in the cinematic sense and more about just continuing to do the next necessary thing when you'd rather not. That's what resilience actually looks like from the inside. It's not impressive, it's just persistent. What I hope, if any of this is useful to anyone, is that these 3 things stay with you. Do right by people, especially when it would be easier not to. That's what lets you stand in a courtroom and tell the truth without flinching. Understand what you're actually dealing with before you react. That's what turns a devastating dinner into a winnable case. And keep going when it's hard, not because you're certain it'll work out, but because the people counting on you need you to. That's what gets you to the other side. Abby is teaching me the Cantonese word for beaver. She says I'm saying it wrong. She's probably right.